All right. Lots of people in the waiting room. Let's let them in. All right. Hi, everyone. Hope everybody can hear me. Zoom is always a little weird when I start it running. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you for letting me know. And good morning to everyone. So today, we'll wait for more people to show up, of course. And then I want to talk a little bit about the critical responses, because they are coming up next week. I believe they're due on January 28th, I believe. Of course, always double check the syllabus, right, for dates and deadlines. So yeah, once we okay, right. So just note that they're due. I got my classes mixed up. So your critical response is due the 27th at midnight. But if you're a little bit after that deadline, maybe you're working on it at the last minute, and you just get so absorbed in your awesome critical analysis that you're writing that by the time you finish, you don't notice that it's 10 past midnight. I don't know. I'm not going to dock any late marks for anything like that. In fact, because of the fair and compassionate grading guidelines that have been in place over the pandemic, I really haven't been that big of a late mark deductor, if you know what I mean. I tend not to do that unless, I use the honor system when people have a late assignment. Most of the time, I find, at least during the pandemic, most of the time people have a pretty darn good excuse. They're ill, perhaps they're stressed out, they've got a family situation, a work situation, a living situation, some kind of situation, right? So I'm just letting you know, don't, if you miss a deadline, just let me know what's going on, and don't worry, don't panic, right? Okay, so there's still some people trickling in. My nose is stuffy today. I hope I'm not getting sick. Oh, that wouldn't be good. But anyway, let's sort of ease into things by talking about the critical response. So yeah, we've already gone over the due date. You can find the template on Brightspace. There's a module on Brightspace called Helpful Materials, and it contains templates and links. And I highly recommend you use the template, just because it helps keep everything organized, right? In the file name, it just says, put your name here. Just do that in the file name, and make sure to add all your student information. Right, there's a place you can do that in the upper right-hand corner of the template. You can add your name. Really, that's all you have to do is add your name and the date. Everything else is already there, right? The course code, so on. You'll want to give your response a title. It doesn't have to be particularly catchy or profound, but it should capture the issue that you've decided to critically assess. And we can go over some examples of those kinds of titles. In fact, we can workshop this a little bit. I think that would be a good idea, since most of the grading in this class is based upon these responses or upon the essay or the essay proposal, right? It's all writing, right? So I want to make sure that everybody has a pretty good idea of what they're doing. So yeah, give a descriptive title. If you can come up with a cool, catchy title, that's great. But otherwise, just give me a title that kind of really sums up what you're going to be talking about. Now, for the topics, again, you want to kind of pick something that you can actually say something about in the space that you have, right? Because these are not very long, 500 to 750 words. If you go a little bit over that, that's fine, but do not go under the limit. But whatever you can talk about in that time. Dula, question, go ahead.
Hi, so when you say a little bit over, is like 100 words fine, or are you thinking more like 50?
I'd say between 50 to 100 words.
Okay.
Yeah. And of course, your word count doesn't include anything you cite on the references section, right? So that shouldn't count towards your word count. But yeah, it's okay to go a little bit over, but I wouldn't go under. Or I would really try not to go under, because you don't leave yourself enough. You don't leave yourself enough room to really say what you could say, right? So what are you supposed to do with this? Okay, so I want you to critically engage with an idea that you find interesting. And yeah, we haven't covered that much of the book so far. Like, by the time that this is due, we'll have covered the first chapter and maybe a little bit of the second chapter. So I wouldn't go ahead in the book and try to cover something from the third or fourth chapter. I would not try to do that. But something from the first or second chapter is probably fine. And again, anything we've discussed in lecture is also fair game. Yeah, just to go to the chat real quick. The 500 to 750 words. Yeah, that's well, okay. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, no. Intro, body, conclusion should all be 7. That should be that's your word count. Yeah. So the total word count is intro, body, conclusion. Yeah. The only thing that doesn't count towards your word count are your works cited section. If you have a title page, stuff like that. So yeah, no problem. So right, critical analysis on some ideas from what we've covered so far. So what does this mean? Critical analysis. Has anybody done any critical analysis before? Sometimes we don't call it that. We call it critiquing. We call it discussing, right? I'm sure that many of you have done something like this before. Who wants to describe some of their previous efforts? Go ahead.
So yeah, I don't know if this is entirely related, but last year in a kind of fourth year class, we had a lot of the bulk of the course was just reading documents and critiquing them. So it was more or less like, okay, at least for this professor and how he wanted to stylize it, it was like, all right, read the document, explain kind of some things you were having trouble understanding. Could you compare them to some previous readings that we've done and whatnot? So I don't know if that is kind of in the similar vein, because at least for me right now, I'm partially understanding how to do the critical analysis. They kind of pick a topic from what we've talked about in class and not just reiterate it and repeat it, but just kind of add more to it,
Yeah, exactly. Like you're definitely probably going to have to do definitely probably. Yeah, no, you're probably going to have to do some summary, right? You're going to have to summarize the idea that you want to talk about. But a critical response certainly can't just be summary. So as you say, you might want to zero in on something that doesn't make sense to you, or maybe that does make a lot of sense to you, and you can explain why. right? Or you could explain why you disagree with it, or something like that, right? So you want to go beyond summary, and actually engage with the ideas. Say like, I agree with this, I disagree with this, or I kind of agree with this, except for this, or something, right? So
Just one more thing I wanted to ask. So
Sure.
one thing that I guess I was a bit more confused about from reading the Discord and whatnot, and also being in the class, are we limited to just kind of one topic, or can we say like, hey, this was one area I really enjoyed, here are the reasons why, and then also maybe in the intro just mentioning how there was one thing I didn't agree with fully? Because I at least for me, maybe I need to rewatch the videos and relook at the relook at the textbook. But I feel like one of the topics I want to pick can maybe get almost probably up to say halfway, of the minimum, halfway or more to the minimum word count. But I'm not sure if I can go any further.
Yeah, I think it's better to stick with a single topic. And if you find that you don't have enough, like there's not enough to talk about, then I mean, you can also relate ideas from outside of the class, or interesting examples of things from perhaps outside of the class to what you're talking about. So that can be a way to sort of fill things out too. But if you've picked an idea that doesn't really give you that much to talk about, I would try to
Another topic.
Yeah,
Okay.
something more substantial. So, okay, just a couple quick questions in the chat, and then I'll go ahead and answer Max's question. So, are we allowed to use personal pronouns? Yeah, totally. I don't understand why. I think this is a high school English thing, where your English teacher tells you don't use the first person pronoun I. Philosophers do this all the time. If you go read like any journal, that's the way we write. So I don't know why people are told not to do this, but yeah, it's absolutely fine. You can write in the first person, you can write in the third person. If you want to get really fancy, you can use the royal we, right? In this paper, we will argue that blah, 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 right? If you want to get really fancy with it. So that's fine. Is it acceptable to say to use one or more of the concepts covered? I mean, yeah, I think that's fun. If you can bring the themes of the book to bear on something else, and if that's something else, whether that's a movie or a book or something, if that also works as a really great example of something that we're talking about in the class, then that is that's good too. And I've done that before myself in like stuff that I've published, where I've used movies. So yeah, you can totally do that. That's totally fine. Okay, so so before I move on, oh yeah, Max had a question. Go ahead, Max. Sorry, you've had your hand up for a while.
That's okay. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I took a course, I think 2 years ago, called Philosophy of Science, where we had like very similar layout of reading responses. And like, I don't know, I'm kind of boring. So I just like pick one thing, like literally just one thing in one reading. Or if it's like, we have like 2 readings for a class, but we don't usually. It's more so like this chapter. So if I were to write it, I don't know, for the topic by this week, I would just like quickly summarize and like have like I wouldn't even summarize it actually. I would just like demonstrate my understanding through a summarization of what I'm interested in. So like if it was about the definitions of technology, I'd have to briefly explain that I know what each definition is. And then the critical analysis part would just me be saying like, this definition, in my opinion, is better for these reasons and these ones, or perhaps these two aren't so dissimilar after all. And then that it's like, it just like, it's only 750 words. So I just kind of acknowledge I don't really have the time to do more than have a hyper focus on one thing. Like, well, maybe like I could just like turn, like the analysis part could just be like turning the words into like numbers and then like comparing if it logically makes sense. So that could be a whole analysis in them itself. So
Yeah,
it's pretty short, you know.
Yeah, and that's okay, because if you find like, oh, I came up with this cool idea, but I don't have the space to talk about it. Well, I mean, part of the reason why I'm having you do this is because not only is it practice for writing and critiquing, but it also helps you generate ideas, which might be useful for your essay topic proposal, right? So that's okay. It's good to be hyper focused here, and if you come up with other ideas, you can write them down and save them for later too. As far as how I typically grade these things, everybody wants to know what they need to do to get an A+, right? So in my classes, I guess A+s are not impossible to get, but they're not easy to get either. You would have to present a very thoughtful response that's free of all errors. No errors at all. No errors of reasoning, no errors of spelling or grammar. And not only that, but A+ material, I like to give A+ if somebody comes up with something that I haven't read about or thought about or come up with before, right? If you surprise me, then that could be A+ material. And if everything else is technically perfect. A range, we're talking 1 or 2 little mistakes, little hiccups here and there. A paper in the B range is going to have probably more errors. It may be a little bit too summative and maybe not very heavy on the critical analysis. A paper in the C range, papers in the C range are those that are like all summary and no critical analysis, right? If you just parrot what I say in lecture or what's on the slides and just kind of summarize it and spit it back out, like, okay, you're not doing the assignment if you do that, right? You need to engage with the ideas. And a D range paper is going to be even worse than that. I seldom give out Ds. But a paper in the D range is going to be like full of spelling, grammar, punctuation errors. It's going to have misunderstandings of the material. It's not only going to be only summative and not critical, but if you're getting things wrong, then you're in the D range, right? And if it's even, how is that even a D? Well, I try not to be too brutal of a marker, right? I suppose in other classes that would fail you. But yeah, a paper that does fail is, it really does seldom happen. Unless somebody just doesn't submit an assignment or submits an incomplete assignment. So those are rules of thumb that I would keep in mind. And your TA will be aware of these as well. So Liam, we have a TA now. Liam introduced himself in the Discord channel. So everybody should make sure they're on Discord, and Liam's contact information is there. He will be grading most of these, by the way. So yeah, those are the ranges, just make sure you're free of errors of reasoning and errors of writing. And you'll probably do okay. I don't have an example ready that I can share at the moment. I haven't had a chance to track down any of my old students and ask them. So I don't have anything that I can share right now, but I will try over the weekend to find something. Yes, external sources need to be cited. So even if you want to talk about general knowledge, like if you wanted to talk about Einstein's theory, yeah, I would try and find something, just something. And there are internet encyclopedias, right? I wouldn't use Wikipedia, but there are like physics encyclopedias on university websites that you could use, for example, if you wanted to talk about, say, Einstein's theories. I would cite it. It's just good practice, you know, even if we all know, oh yeah, his special and general theory and blah, 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 blah. Even if we all know that, you as the writer and me as the reader who's evaluating, it's still good practice to cite everything properly, right? And of course, when it comes to citations, use the guide that I've put on Brightspace, Purdue University's OWL online writing lab. It has all of the citation styles, everything you need to know, anything that you could possibly want to cite. The instructions for how to do so are on Purdue's OWL. So, is it essential that we relate our analysis to content we've discussed in class? Yes, yes. You've got to be tackling ideas that are coming up in the book or in the lectures. You can relate outside sources to those ideas if you want, though, right? So if you want to talk about an idea from another class or a different philosopher that we're not coming or that we're not covering, or a you know, like a movie or a book or whatever, right? You can do that. That's absolutely fine. So we should probably think about finishing off the chapter. Does anybody have any other questions before we get to that? Any questions at all about the critical responses? Okay. All right, so we'll share the screen. Now's when my computer will start going slow. Yep. There we go. All right, so yeah, if the file name here is a little confusing, I apologize. I thought we would cover this last time. So week 2, lecture 1. It's actually week 2, lecture 2. Nah, come on, computer. Okay, here we go. So now that we've talked about Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn, we'll move on to talk about an area of sociology called the sociology of scientific knowledge. And this is fun. What does Dusek have to say about this? On page 17, he writes that the work of Kuhn and a number of other philosophers of science of the period opened thinking about science to a number of issues and considerations that the positive approach to science as a body of statements had overlooked or not considered worthy of investigation. Kuhn's paradigmatic approach opened science to the kinds of examination that humanists had traditionally used in examining art and culture. And just by way of example of this sort of shift in sociology, Dusek gives a couple of, name drops a couple of thinkers here, like Karl Mannheim, who was a sociologist who in the 1930s investigated the sociology of knowledge with respect to certain kinds of beliefs, like political beliefs and religious beliefs, but not with respect to scientific claims. So this is a sort of pre-Kuhn example. Before the sociology of scientific knowledge was a thing, before sociology turned its focus on science, the way that, as Dusek says, humanists would traditionally examine art and culture, right? As we move forward in time, things start to change a little bit, right? We get thinkers like Robert Merton. He was a sociologist who studied scientific norms, and he identified a number of different norms that scientists kind of adhere to, and this would be part of the paradigm, right? This is a sort of description of what Kuhn is calling a paradigm. It's not an exhaustive one, but it's part of it. So scientific norms he studied include things like universalism, disinterestedness, which is supposed to be, supposed to mean being free of bias, communism, which is funny, the free sharing of data and results, which of course, yeah, that's part of scientific practice. I suppose I mean, a lot of journals are hidden behind it. See to doubt and question results and theories, right? So these are norms that scientists ought to practice, right? But as a sociologist, Merton is not, he's just identifying the norms. He is doing something descriptive with norms. And maybe actually this would be a good time to pause and make sure that everybody understands the difference. This is a difference that I guess any good philosopher or scientist should be aware of this. But what is the difference between, norms and descriptions? Can we come up with an example of something that's normative versus something that's descriptive? Max, go ahead.
So like, from my understanding, a description is more so, well, describing more dryly like what events are occurring and what's happening, whereas norms is more so looking at what is like the conduct and normal behavior of a group of people. So an example would be like, I'm looking at a crowd of people and I say, I'm describing like, okay, there's a crowd of people, they're walking on the street. And then the norm would be like, these people are all walking on the right hand side of the street when they're going down that way. So I don't know, it's probably the best way I could describe it in just like in simple terms, but like a norm is clearly a societal thing where it's like a societal accepted way, modus vivendi kind of thing. Whereas a description is like just describing what that is.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting close. Yeah. As Dane says here, normative statements contain should or ought, right? So Jonah, I like your example too. Coffee is well, I mean, coffee is good can mean like, does coffee taste good, or is coffee is it good to have coffee? One of those is normative, the other is not. Think is versus ought, right? Descriptive statements tell you the way the world is. Normative statements tell you the way things ought to be, right? So these are norms for scientists. These are what scientists ought to do. They ought to follow these norms. But Merton, as a sociologist, is not, arguing, hey, everybody, you ought to follow my norms. No, he's just describing the paradigm, right? And this is different from what Mannheim was about. Mannheim wasn't doing anything with scientific claims, right? Because I suppose the influence of positivism was, this was when positivism was in its heyday, and back then we were all about logical empiricism, verifying statements, verificationism and stuff, right? So let's move on to the next slide now that we know the difference between what is normative and what is descriptive. Come on. Here we go. Now, what the sociology of scientific knowledge approach really does is, quote, it claims that statements, laws, and experiments of science are themselves legitimate objects of scientific investigation. And this is different from, as we saw, different from thinkers like Mannheim. Earlier sociologists of science believed that we could explain, for example, scientific errors with psychological or sociological causes, but that we couldn't actually explain scientific truths with psychological or sociological causes. But things started to change after Kuhn. We had thinkers like David Bloor, who in 1976 initiated what he called, or what's come to be known as, the Strong Program. And these are a number of principles, which I'll read here. This is from, again, page 17 in Dusek. The principles he proposed were a principle of symmetry, that the same sort of causal explanations ought to be given of both truth and error in science, and of both rational and irrational behavior. So this is normative. Remember, before, the previous principles were descriptive or rather what we were reading just a moment ago were descriptions of norms that scientists were adhering to. These are norms that sociologists of scientific knowledge will adhere to. So here, as I quoted a minute ago, the statements, laws, and experiments of science are themselves objects of scientific investigation. That's what we're doing here, right? To continue, he also proposed the causality principle, that all explanations of scientific knowledge should be causal. The impartiality principle, that the sociology of scientific knowledge should be impartial with respect to truth and falsity, rationality and irrationality. And D, the reflexivity principle, that these principles should apply to sociology itself. So these are norms that sociologists should use as scholars and thinkers who study science itself. This is the beginning of what we're calling science studies, not an uncontroversial field, as we'll see as we get to the end of the lecture. But just think about how interesting this is, right? What Bloor is saying here is like, look, for example, the same kind of explanations should account for why and how scientists arrive at truth, as well as when they get it wrong. And this is different than what sociologists were saying before. They were saying, prior to Kuhn, sociologists of science were saying things like, look, if a scientist gets something really wrong, if they fail to understand the way nature is, like let's say a classic debate, Lamarckian evolution versus Darwinian evolution. I'm sorry if this is a weird sciencey example. There's going to be lots of sciencey examples in this class. This kind of has to be. But imagine Darwinian evolution versus Lamarckian evolution. Darwin, whose theory is accepted today, thought that traits were inherited by future generations, and if these traits were adaptive, if they increased fitness, helped you have lots of babies and multiply, then those traits would be selected for. And the traits are passed on. Darwin didn't know about genes, but he did have some ideas about heredity. Then there was Lamarck. Lamarck had a different theory of evolution, which stated that changes can happen within evolutionary changes can happen within the lifetime of an organism. My favorite example is actually from an old episode of Bill Nye the Science Guy, where Bill Nye uses the example of a giraffe. Like, if you wanted to have a longer neck, maybe you could just stretch it out. So giraffes on Lamarckian evolution got their long necks by trying to stretch their necks to the trees, and their necks got longer. And then when they had baby giraffes, their babies' necks were longer, and they stretched their necks more. It's an interesting idea. It's not the right explanation for why, for example, giraffes have evolved long necks. So that's one example of this debate where previously, prior to Kuhn, sociologists would say, like, we can explain why Lamarck got it wrong by talking about errors, biases, and all kinds of stuff, right? But we can't explain how Darwin got it right using the same approach. What these principles say in the strong program of sociology of scientific knowledge is that we need to understand when science works, when it succeeds, and when it fails the same way. And I think this is really nicely exemplified by Harry Collins, who just bracketed questions of scientific truth. And he studied fields, vastly different fields, using the same methodology. He studied pseudosciences like parapsychology and proper science like physics and astronomy, astrophysics, studying gravitational waves. He studied these two bodies of work using the same methodology. And I think that's really interesting. So that's the strong program. Let's see. Now, in the sociology of scientific knowledge, a lot of sociologists adhere to this idea of the social construction of scientific knowledge. And there are various versions of this. You've probably heard of social constructionism or social constructivism. It's something that we see in sociology and some philosophy. What is social constructivism? Anybody want to take a crack at it? Max, go ahead.
Wouldn't it be a bit of a challenge? There's these natural inherent laws of the way things work and how humans work. It's more so saying that like the society that we construct and as social beings, the relationships we form and like the groups we form or whatever, like those things is what necessarily shapes. I wouldn't necessarily say like everything. And I don't think every social constructivist thinks that it is everything, but it's more so like challenging and adding like some more, maybe political factors or more like historiographical factors to how we would look at science or look at the world.
Yeah. Like you say, there are different versions of this, and like the book says, the book kind of casts it in terms of like strong and weak versions. But yeah, social constructionism is all about Max, gender norms are a great example of a social construction. That's probably the one that everybody's familiar with. Just because of the zeitgeist that we're in right now, right? Yeah, that's another good example, Jonah. Meaning is found not in the object, but in the social interactions around them. Yeah, those are good examples. The gender one is probably the most pertinent example. Gender as a social construction means that it doesn't mean that everything's made up, right? Like there is biological sex. But like Max says here, clothing and dress norms, these are constructed, right? And a lot of people, I suspect that these thinkers would say that they're just fabrics, right? Like these are just socially, it's just convention, right? Like remember when Harry Styles like broke Ben Shapiro's mind by wearing a dress? Like I loved it. So basically, and also pants. I mean, pants used to be only worn by barbarians. And this is true. This is true. The civilized Greeks and Romans wore robes and gowns, and they were like, only those barbarians wear pants. Now we all wear pants. And not only do us guys wear pants, but women used to never wear pants. Yes. Togas for life. Yeah. So, now we all wear pants. Women wear pants. These are just things we do. So, yeah, that's a good example, right? So that's the weak version. The weak version would say, when it comes to science, that social interaction is the basis for forming scientific theories and experiments. And it's up to you how reasonable you think this is. I think it's quite reasonable. I think that just because of the zeitgeist we're in, social constructivism kind of can make some thinkers jump, because it makes it sound like, oh, someone's trying to say everything's made up, and that's not what it is. At least not the weak version, right? So if social interaction in humans is the basis for forming scientific and theories and experiments, I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I think that sounds reasonable. That sounds incredibly reasonable. So Max says everything is a social construct. So you might be more sympathetic to the strong version of this thesis. But before we get to the strong version, I mean, how, is this reasonable? Social interaction in humans is the basis for forming theories and experiments. Yeah, right? That's okay. I mean, lots of things are, and it's fine. It doesn't mean if something's a social construction, it doesn't mean that it's fake or something, right? It means that it comes out of socialization. So I'm going to try to come up with a sciencey example to try and illustrate. Well, think about, let's go to an old paradigm, back to Aristotle's paradigm. Aristotle's doing natural philosophy. He's sitting by his lagoon, watching storks eat frogs and, grabbing some animals to go and vivisect later or something, right? He's not doing experiments. He's just thinking by himself. And he comes up with some explanations of nature that seem to make sense on his paradigm. But of course, we arguably have a much better sense of the way the world works now with modern physics. And that certainly is a social enterprise, it seems to me. We have conferences, we publish papers. It's a thing that humans do. Science is a thing humans do, just like religion. And I'm not saying that the truth claims that science and religion make are identical. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying they're both things that humans do. And by the way, that's another example of a social construction. Religion would be a social construction. Going back to the idea of gender is like a social construction, right? Sex is not. At least not on the weak version of this theory. Sex, like biological sex, is the biological part, and gender is the social part. And sometimes they can become decoupled, which is fine. But yeah, oftentimes we talk about one when we're actually talking about the other, and that's an example. We got religion, gender, lots of social constructs. How does this apply to technology? I think it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to me. What about the strong version, though? The strong version is, I think, what gets some people nervous. The strong version says that the objects of science or scientific truth themselves are socially constructed. So it depends what we mean by scientific truth, right? But I want to let you guys take a crack at this. What do you think of the strong version of the thesis that objects of science or scientific truths are socially constructed? What do we think about that? Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, man, just include funding in the equation and then see what we're allowed to even research. Like, what? Like, we can't do any research on drugs because they're illegal, or a company is like, okay, well, here's the money, go research this, or the university is like, research this. So like the nature of which we're even allowed to do science is within a social paradigm. So yeah, I'm not saying that rocks don't exist, but I'm saying like which rocks we're looking at was really dependent on a lot of social factors, and thus is constructed.
I think there's something to what you said for sure. Yeah. The other, what Emily says, though, I think Emily also makes a really good point in the chat. Like, are atoms socially constructed? Well, I mean, how you answer this is probably going to depend on whether you're a realist or an anti-realist about science. Remember those terms? What is science doing? Is science providing a picture of the world as it actually is? Or is science just giving us tools to make predictions about the world? What camp you sit in will probably maybe play some role in whether or not you think that atoms are socially constructed. I think there exist things, like obviously the world exists, right? But our descriptions of the world depend a lot on, on the sociology of science. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah. You can I could call an atom something else. It's still an atom, right? There's still something that exists. Jonah, go ahead.
I I really like what you said about it's yeah, the difference between a realist and an anti-realist. The realist believes that their science is doing something right there, and the atom is what we call the atom. But the anti-realist goes, the atom is, we're calling something an atom, and we think it's the atom,
Yeah.
but it might not be. But that's why social construction is important.
Yeah.
What Emily just said. We can call it a teddy bear. Yeah, but if I'm talking to you and I talk about a teddy bear, and we're really talking about two different things, there's nothing that can get done there.
Yeah.
And social construction is the shared language.
Yeah. And I think Julien in the chat kind of really makes that point well. We socially agreed that this thing is called an atom. Yeah, that's right. As long as language is involved, Holden says, it seems that there will be a certain amount of social construction. I mean, yeah. And this really gets to some crazy cool stuff. I mean, this is kind of why positivism ended, right? Along comes Wittgenstein and says, hey, you know, the limits of what we can talk about are kind of the limits of what we can understand. So,
yeah,
you know,
well, we've grown, we've gotten so much more of a scientific knowledge, but the world itself hasn't like gotten more scientific principles. We've just been able to articulate them.
Yeah, exactly. And we I mean, I think we're never going, I mean, I'm not like a realist in the metaphysical sense. I mean, I guess I am. I guess I'm an indirect realist, right? I'm kind of like with Kant and his noumena and phenomena. I think that there's only so close we can get to the way things really are. And again, another reason why I bring up Wittgenstein is because I think that how close we can get to understanding how things really are in part depends upon the language we have to talk about the things that are. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I call myself a Spinozist because I think we can work towards knowledge of nature, of God, which he says are the same thing, but we'll never get a full picture of it because
yeah,
we're only human.
Yeah, we're just these finite beings. It's true. So, okay, a lot of really cool stuff. Okay, so now that I've kind of got my finger on the pulse there, well, like we were talking about language, you know, it depends on what we mean by scientific truth, right? Oh, there's a lot happening in the chat. Let me just, Zach, yeah, Goodle, good old Goodle. Kush says we're not shown what atoms actually look like. That's true. Yeah, lots of, so okay, so back to language. The strong version says objects of science or scientific truths are socially constructed. It depends what we mean by scientific truth. If scientific truth is what we take to be true or what we believe to be true, then this theory just collapses into the weaker one, right? If that's what we mean by scientific truth, then this is just another version of the weak version, right? The basis for theories and experiments and knowledge is social interaction. So we're just all agreeing like, oh yeah, we're going to call this fuzzy thing an atom, and atoms have certain properties and they're made out of certain subatomic particles and so on and so on, so on and so forth. If that's what the truth is, then yeah, this is just the weak version. But if there's no difference between the truth and what we take to be true, well, then it kind of stands on its own. And this is called consensus theory. So, but Dusek reminds us, opponents of the extreme social construction view claim that the objects we think exist may not be the same as the objects that genuinely exist, and that what our community holds to be true may not be true. I think I'm okay with that. I think I sit squarely in the weak version. And if I seem to be in the strong camp, it's because I'm in this bit that collapses into the weak camp. That's me. And by the way, by me telling you this is not me advocating for you to be, a weak social constructivist or a strong social constructivist. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. That's not my job, right? I want to give you the tools to think, and you can decide for yourself. Are you a social constructivist, weak, strong? Maybe you're not a social constructivist at all. Whatever, it's all good. So let's go on to social epistemology. Social epistemology is cool because it's a lot more normative than sociology of scientific knowledge. I mean, as Dusek points out, and as I've pointed out at the bottom of the slides, neither the descriptive approaches that we talked about before from sociology of scientific knowledge, nor the sociologists who were working previous to that are completely normatively neutral. But social epistemology is meant to be primarily normative. And here's another really cool example of normative versus descriptive, by the way, right? Take two fields like psychology versus epistemology. Logic is a good one. Psychology, oh, my computer's so slow. Psychology is descriptive, right? Cognitive psychology, for example, tries to understand how people reason, how perception and reasoning works, right? So it's descriptive. So, but if you're doing like logic or epistemology, you're doing something normative, right? If psychology tells us how people reason, logic tells us how we ought to reason. If psychology helps us understand belief and how belief works in the mind, epistemology helps us understand when our beliefs are correct and well justified, and which beliefs we ought to have and which we ought to discard, right? So social epistemology is very normative. For our purposes here, it's concerned with knowledge claims that are made by scientists, and it treats scientific knowledge as a social achievement, not an individual achievement, a social achievement. It does contrast with descriptive approaches like Kuhn's, but again, it's none of this is really completely neutral, normatively speaking. So social epistemology is probably something that's going to keep coming up in this class. And we'll have occasion to talk about it more in future. Likewise with different perspectives from feminism, ecology, multicultural science and technology studies, right? A lot of thinkers in these areas have taken up Kuhn's ideas that culture and worldview are significant with respect to the nature of scientific theories, right? Science doesn't happen in a vacuum. People do science, and some people are women. Some people are from different cultures, right? So yeah, like Kuhn really opened the way for this kind of talk, and I think it's great myself. I don't understand why some scientists are threatened by this kind of thing. I don't think that by understanding how science works as a human enterprise, we undermine scientific truth. I just don't think that's how it works, and I don't understand why people have that worry, but whatever. So what do these thinkers do? They criticize dominant social attitudes and the theories and methods of science and technology that result from the society in question. What are some examples that we could come up with here of maybe a criticism we could offer against science, which results from the society in question? And think of society loosely here. It doesn't have to be like, Western society. It could be even just from, some particular lab somewhere. See if we can come up with some examples. Max.
Sorry, you were just asking about like the examples that illustrate like critiques to Western dominative practice, right?
Yeah, like there are social attitudes and theories present in a society that births
Oh,
scientific
I got
truth.
one.
Okay,
Okay, okay. Here's one. Western society loves to write things down. Oh boy, do they love it! So it's like looking at the scientific method and looking at empiricism, like the use of like written language and writing things down as recording information as seen as like a solid way of like cataloging information and more superior than oral tradition, for example.
yeah,
So that's how I would say it's just like a different value of even knowledge recording where certain cultures are better retaining information through oral traditions because that's how they do it. And that's just not being seen as a legitimate way of recording
yeah.
history or recording scientific fact.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with what's an idea that's coming up called local knowledge that we'll talk about. But I think that if someone were to point this out, they would be doing what Dusek is describing here, kind of showing that, like, okay, what you're calling objective knowledge actually comes out of a society that has certain attitudes and certain methods that are taken to be the right way to do things. And we should be able to ask, is that really the right way to do it, right? Yes, that's a really good example. I'll come back to that in a second. Ethics of scientific methods, it maybe. I want to talk about, yeah, different cultures do have different views on ethics. Ethics is tricky. Research ethics is not really my jam, but what Amia says here, a lot of medical diagnostic tools are based on how symptoms manifest in men. Heart attack symptoms typically look different in women. Yes, this is a good example. This is the kind of example, right? Medical knowledge. I'm going to use a mental health example. And this is even kind of like a double example too, actually, now that I think about it. But if you think of medical knowledge, like how certain brains come to be, right? And what they're like somebody with ADD or somebody who's autistic, right? There's a scientific consensus, or until recently, there was some scientific consensus on say what ADHD looks like, what autism looks like, right? In men, because these two disorders were primarily studied in boys. But now we've come to realize quite recently that autism and ADHD are just as prevalent in women, but they present differently. And they have not been studied as much. And that's because, the methodology was bad. We were only looking at half the population. And not only that, a lot of the early thinkers who, identified these conditions and studied them were not autistic or not ADHD people, right? And when you read some of the descriptions of these kids that they offer, it's just awful. It's awful. They talk about them like being like robots or missing something. It's terrible. So that's why we do this, right? That's why we do this. Now, And I think we've already kind of talked about this bottom point, but yeah, cultural studies and anthropology will sometimes criticize the view that Western science and technology are universal. I think we had a really good example of that with the oral versus written tradition. Yeah. Yeah, now we have the term neurodivergent. That's right. And the early doctors studying neurodivergent kids were not neurodivergent themselves, and I think that's a tragedy. It's the way things were. I mean, before we knew what autism was, people who maybe would be diagnosed or be on the spectrum now, they would either learn to get by, or they'd be placed in some kind of sanitarium for their entire life. That's terrible, you know. Vicente, that's a great example. Yeah, seat belts. If we only use male crash test dummies, then we don't know how dangerous a seatbelt could be for pregnant women. Yeah, that's an excellent example. So yeah, we can think of lots of examples. So yeah, I think we all agree, like maybe we should, turn a critical eye on science itself. Absolutely. Whoops. Then we have, silly computer. Okay, then we have non-local knowledge. Come on, computer. My computer's not working because I need to criticize society more. Oh, come on. Go on. Go back one more slide. Come on. There we go. Local knowledge. I'm just going to read this bit, which I've taken out of the book, but the notion of local knowledge is also emphasized here, in feminism, multicultural technology studies, and so on. Local knowledge in non-literate societies has often contained considerable knowledge of medicinal and other values of local plants, agricultural techniques, survival skills in harsh climates, and navigational skills. Contemporary ethnobotanists investigate indigenous cures and the chemistry of plants used by local healers. Western Arctic explorers borrowed the design of their clothing and many survival techniques from the Inuits and other inhabitants of the Arctic, usually without crediting them. Apparently, local religiously based seasonal cycles of planting, such as those in Bali, have sometimes proven more agriculturally effective than the recommendation of Western experts. So yeah, and like Max mentioned, in a lot of these cultures, we're talking about an oral tradition, not a written one. But hey, these people have been surviving and thriving in very harsh environments, I would say quite successfully, using this oral tradition. So, they're doing something right. Something is working, just saying. And let's not forget that science is fairly new and the human race has been around, a long time. And we were hunting and gathering for a long time before we started doing agriculture. And then we did agriculture for a long time before we came up with science, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, Dane, I would say that's exactly right. And this goes all the way back to the Greeks, I think, to ancient Greece, which is, this is a whole big jump through time. But yeah, in Western science, even just Western society as a whole, we look at the human as somebody who stands apart from nature. Indigenous cultures, and in a lot of Asian and African cultures, the human being is seen as a part of nature, right? But in the West, yeah, it's like we're standing outside of nature, and that's because of the ancient Greeks. That goes all the way back to Greek rationalism, where you had the ancient Greeks saying, like, look, we can use logos, our reason, to stand outside of nature, physis, and understand cosmos, the ordered whole of everything, right? And yeah, Dula, as you say, Western society is a lot more individualistic. I would say that many other societies, whether we're talking Aboriginal societies or whether we're talking about other more developed but non-Western societies, like, I don't know, think of Japan, it's much more communitarian, right? Think of the response to COVID. Individualism versus collectivism. Compare Japan and the United States, right? In the United States, it's all about freedom, blah, 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 blah. People don't want to wear masks. People protest, oh, I have to wear a mask. I don't want to get a vaccine. Me. Whereas in Japan, it's like, okay, I'm going to wear my mask. Yeah, I'm going to get my vaccine, because it's not about me. It's about the community, right? So I think probably, totally colonialism has a role. Absolutely. Absolutely. I could talk about this until the cows come home. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Just one quick example. Like the marine chronometer, right? In the age of exploration and the Enlightenment, and prior to that, the Renaissance, we started thinking of the clockwork universe, right? Which had an enormous influence on physics. And the clockwork mechanism was the metaphor for the universe, because at the time, it was also the metaphor for the human being, by the way. We are machines, like Descartes. We are automata endowed with a soul, right? Or if you talk to like Julien D'Offray de la Mettrie, who was like the anti-Descartes, he would say, no, we're just soulless machines, but so are animals. But we kind of do have a soul. Anyway, I'm totally going off topic. But the marine chronometer was a device used for navigation, and it was kind of like the conceptual tool for thinking of the cosmos, for thinking of a mechanical universe. Nowadays, we do the same thing with computers. Like, we think of minds as computers because we have computers. Computers are so ubiquitous. And these marine chronometers were used on the ships that were sailing and trading and colonizing and enslaving and doing all that stuff, and there were tragic things that came out of this, and there are perhaps more positive developments that came out of this. It's colonialism sucks, but on the other hand, we have the modern world, and for better or for worse, here we are, I guess, with computers and stuff. Yeah, expect it to work. Yeah, like a robot. Well, did you know that the word robot means drudgery? The word robot comes from the Czech word robota, and it was coined by Karl Čapek, who was a playwright who wrote the first play about robots. And the Czech word, robota, drudgery, this is what they would call the peasants. The peasants were robots, just working, toiling all day. And nowadays we call automatons robots, but so slightly different etymology, but yeah. Anyway, another interesting thing, oh God, I hope I can wrap this up soon. We're running out of time, but there was the science wars. People have probably heard of the science wars. So on page 21, Dusek writes, with the post-Kuhnian development of politically critical studies of science by feminists, activists in indigenous circles, ecologists, and others, as well as the development of sociological studies of scientific knowledge and literary studies of scientific texts, a backlash has arisen. And how? So in the 90s, something happened called the science wars. And as I mentioned earlier, some scientists and technologists thought that the objectivity of their field was being challenged. And they were joined by political conservatives, opponents of feminism, traditionalists, people who we still have around today, in the so-called science wars. So Alan Sokal, a physicist, very famously wrote an article called Transgressing the Boundaries toward a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity or something in 1995. And he published it in a postmodern philosophy journal, I believe, called Social Texts. It was satire. It was made up. It had a bunch of nonsense, non-scientific nonsense. He was able to get it published. And then he revealed that, I just made it up. Gotcha. Ha, And this is the Sokal hoax, or the Social Texts affair. It was widely publicized. The buzz died down in the new millennium. But what Sokal did was essentially say, tried to, I think, there are two legitimate sides to this. Sokal on the one hand is poisoning the well, right? He feels like, feminism, sociology are threatening the objectivity of science. If we critique science, we threaten its objectivity. I don't think that's true, as I said earlier. I think we actually make science better when we understand why it goes wrong because of humans, because it's a human activity. It makes science better. Duh. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's almost like he's dogmatic. He sounds like a positivist, right? He's such a positivist. He would have gotten along great with those Vienna Circle guys, right? It would have been a Vienna Circle jerk. Rim shot. So SoCal publishes this I did just say that, yeah. I think SoCal would have gotten on great with those guys, but yeah. He's trying to make sociology, feminism, cultural studies. Thank you, everybody. I'm here all week. He's trying to make it look like bullshit because he feels that their project is undermining science. I disagree with him in this. The particular journal he picked is maybe not the best, most rigorous journal. If you read some of the other articles in there, like, yeah, like some postmodern philosophy is not good philosophy because it's just words. But all postmodern philosophy, I don't think it's like this. I don't think you can level this criticism against, you know, the entirety of yeah. I think that the problem is a lot of maybe a lot of postmodernists, a lot of continental folks, you know, they read the big guys like Heidegger and Sartre and Husserl, and they think that they have to try and write in a similar way. But man, you're not Heidegger, you're not Sartre. Like, don't try and write like that. Jonah, go ahead.
And the biggest problem with postmodern philosophy for me, it's directly what you're saying. They feel like they have to write complicated things, but it's that they think that words themselves have so much more power than they do, and they're right to point it out. Like, you know, if you develop a certain category for people, then that category will like continue to be reproduced in different ways socially.
Yeah.
But they take that idea and they extend it to the universe and to everything.
Yeah.
And you get some amazing insights on that like are groundbreaking, and sometimes you just get whole 7,000 page texts.
Yeah.
About the dialectics of the ham and cheese sandwich. It's terrible.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes I think, I mean, basically, I think each side has a point, you know. SoCal maybe did a kind of was a dick move what he did, but he did have a point. But the postmodernists, the feminists, they also have a point as well. And of course, this hasn't really gone away. This kind of public discourse has not gone away. I mean, we're reliving this all the time. Can you think of any examples? Can anybody think of any examples of public discourse that kind of reminds you of the science wars, even if it's just superficially? I've got an example. Jonah, I'm not sure if your hand is up again or if it's just still up from before. Okay, okay. Let's see. Fake news. Oh, absolutely. Fake news. Yeah. But more specific than that. Holden.
Well, I think the most obvious example probably would be certain anti-vax opinions.
Yeah.
This idea that the real scientific data is being hidden, or that there are methods outside of vaccination that are more effective, and that science is being sort of abused by corporate interests or whatever.
Yeah, like I'm thinking, you know, you remind me of that Dr. Malone guy who goes on Joe Rogan and tells you to eat some ivermectin or something, right? This has undermined people's confidence in science.
Right. And it feels like these guys will appeal to science in whatever way that it helps their viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's a good example. Like Jonah summed it up in the chat. Big pharma controls science, you know, like, whoa, you know, oh, it's all big pharma. And it's like, yeah, I know big pharma's like way evil. Like I know that. But on the other hand, I don't think the vaccines are some kind of population control that's being pushed by some kind of a secret society or something. I mean, if you go down these rabbit holes, that's where you end up. You know, it's always just it's always some secret group. Broom Day. I don't know what Broom Day is.
It's always something to do with the CIA
The CIA or aliens or
or the deep state.
The deep state. And these are all dog whistles. Usually these are all dog whistles for the Jews also. So
Yeah.
like, you know, at the bottom, it's just virulent anti-Semitism. And that, yeah.
The postmodern neo-Marxists.
Yeah, exactly. And that's who I was going to offer as an example. Jordan Peterson, whenever he opens his mouth about gender, he goes on and on about the science. And I'm like, it's obvious that you do not know what you're talking about, sir. Could you please stay in your lane? But of course he won't. He just rage quit University Toronto. I don't know if anybody heard, but yeah, he rage quit to go be a Patreon grifter, I suppose. But yeah, whenever he talks about the science, he's not actually talking about the science. So it's just incredibly frustrating. So these are all debates that are, you know, kind of similar to what was going on in the science wars. Holden, is your hands up again or just still up from before? Okay. I think we're almost at the end. Yes, we are. So instrumental realism, you know, so far, oh, wow, Broom Day. Okay, Broom Day, that's what I'm looking for. Broom Day was a thing on social media where people were claiming that there was one day a year where the what? Oh my God, really? For real, that's what? This was the thing that went, did this like go viral on social media? That's amazing. Yeah, Dunning-Kruger. Yeah, Dunning-Kruger effect for Broom Day. That does sound hilarious. I mean, oh my God, I've never heard of Broom Day, but I mean, what? I mean, that's also kind of funny. Can you imagine all of the people trying desperately to get their brooms to stand up and failing on Broom Day, trying to film their broom standing up? That, oh my God. That's hilarious. Yeah. Okay, so instrumental realism. You know, a lot of the thinkers we've talked about up till now are thinking of science as something theoretical, you know, like the Vienna Circle, right? Or even Popper is probably a better example. But later, another approach called instrumental realism would emerge. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Tess. Broom Day is yeah, I see what you did there. So Don Ide, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, comes up with instrumental realism, which Dusek describes like this. The instrumental realists of the 1980s developed a strong focus on the embodied active aspects of science that became a significant movement within the philosophy of science. The active manipulative aspect of instrumental observation takes priority over passive observation and contemplation. Today, most scientific observations are far from the naked eye observations of older astronomy and natural history. The Baconian ideal of induction from pure unbiased perceptions is modified by the technology-laden nature of contemporary scientific observation. French physicists call the tendency to look where our instruments allow us to look the logic of the lamppost. After the old joke about the drunk who looked for his keys under the lamppost because there was light, because there was better light, even though he had dropped his keys down the block where it was pitch black. So for the instrumental realist, come on, slides. For the instrumental realist, technology is prior to science, and it also helps drive science because, you know, as Dusek puts it very nicely, we're far from the days of naked eye observations and just simply using induction or verification. Scientists depend so much on their equipment, and their equipment also drives science. You know, like my example of the James Webb Space Telescope last time, right? So the scientific enterprise depends on technology to a great extent, and technology is prior to science. And this is opposite of the maybe somewhat intuitive view that technology and science are inexorably linked, or even more intuitively that technology is that science is prior to technology, that technology is just applied science. This is the complete opposite of that, right? It's the opposite of this view of technology as applied science. So, and this notion of instrumental realism, where technology is prior to science and also pushes science forward, is similar to Bruno Latour's notion of techno-science, which is probably the coolest term I've encountered in this textbook so far. Techno-science has it that technology and science are linked together like this. Technology and science, you can't have one without the other now. It's also similar to some of Heidegger's later work. Heidegger considered technology as philosophically prior to science. So what instrumental realism does is it helps make the theoretical real, right? The theoretical is real, I suppose, by virtue of how it guides the use and implementation of technology to assess itself. I mean, well, maybe I should have phrased that in a more clear way. Oh, I got a little bit too continental there, a little too postmodernist, but that's okay. The point is that instrumental realism, you know, treating the instruments of science as prior to the science itself, brings us back to inductivism, because we're back to observing and generalizing about the world. So we're just about done. Come on, slides. Right, that's what I meant. Instrumental realism claims that much of what is typically understood as highly abstract, as perceptual, since scientific instruments are like extensions of human perception. That's why it characterizes science as primarily inductive. So we've learned about all of these, and we're out of time. I've gone a little bit too long. Apologies, everyone. Next time, we're going to take a look at chapter 2. So please read chapter 2. We'll try and finish chapter 2 next week. In the meantime, I better get out of here and let you all go as well. And I'll get this lecture uploaded. So thanks, everyone. This was a really good discussion. I had a lot of fun today. Thank you. Take care, everyone. All right, let's get out of here.